Preference share capital. So in this session, we'll go through the introduction of preference share capital. We'll go also through definitions of preference share capital. We'll see what are the voting rights of preference shareholders. And we'll also see the redemption of preference shares. So first, we'll see what is preference share capital. It's a type of security by which a company obtains funds in return for preferential treatment extended to holders of company's equity shares. And this is actually called as a preference share capital. Now, the distribution of earnings and distribution of assets. The position enjoyed by the preference shareholders is a position above equity shareholders in a general preference in income with respect to distribution of earnings. So in income, they enjoy a position above equity shareholders. Also in the distribution of assets, in the event of liquidation of a company, they enjoy a position above equity shareholders. That means whatever is the income which they get, preference shareholders are given first the income, as well as in the distribution of assets, whatever are the returns they get, it will be distributed first to the preference shareholders and then only to equity shareholders in the event of liquidation of the business. Now let us see some definitions of preference share capital. So first definition is according to Section 85 of Companies Act. So according to Section 85 of the Companies Act, preference shares are those shares that have a preference or preferential right to be paid dividends at fixed rates and have a preferential right to the return of capital in the case of liquidation of company business. In the case of financing, preference shares are given preference in the distribution of assets in the case of liquidation and income distribution of the company, which we actually have covered. Next is in legal terms. In legal terms, preference share capital is part of a company's equity base and preference dividends are not tax deductible expenses. It carries a fixed rate and fixed dividend plus preferred prior claims to assets and income, making it a resemblance to a debt. But preference share is a hybrid security, possessing some elements of debt and some elements of equity, and are subordinate to all debts with respect to assets and earnings. It is never ground for liquidation. So, however, it also represents an ownership interest and is never ground for liquidation. In the case of receiving dividends, preference shareholders get it in priority over the equity shareholders. Now, the company may opt to pay dividends, but in the event dividends are distributed, preference shareholders must be given dividends if dividends are to be distributed to equity shareholders. There is no scenario where dividends are only distributed to equity shareholders. If dividends are to be given to equity shareholders, preference shareholders must be given dividend. That is how it is as per Companies Act. So this we cover the definitions of preference share capital. Now that is over. Next we'll take a look at voting rights. So here, according to Section 87 of Companies Act. So according to Section 87 of the Companies Act, preference shareholders can exercise voting rights only on resolutions placed before the company and in matters concerning the rights attached to preference shares. So that is according to Section 87 of Companies Act, which preference shareholders can exercise voting rights only on resolutions placed before the company in matters concerning rights to preference shares. However, if dividends to preference shareholders are not given, they can exercise voting rights on every resolution placed before the company under conditions. So these are the conditions for voting rights which exist for preference shareholders. If the dividends are not given by the company, that is the dividends on preference shares remains unpaid for an aggregate period of not less than 2 years, then preference shareholders can exercise voting rights on every resolution placed before the company. Also, in the case of cumulative preference share, it remains unpaid for a period more than 2 years and not less than 3 years. Preference shareholders can exercise voting rights on every resolution placed before the company. So that is as far as voting rights go. Next is redemption of preference shares. So preference shares are redeemed within a period of 20 years from date of issue according to Section 80A of the Companies Act. Equity shares are not redeemable during the lifetime of the company, whereas preference shares must be redeemed within a period of 20 years from the date of issue. And this is as per Section 80A of the Companies Act. Now, there is no serious penalty for breach of redemption stipulation. So that is there. Also, preference share is cumulative, which would mean all unpaid dividends are carried forward and paid before ordinary dividends are paid. Next is preference shares stated call price. The preference shares stated call price is normally above the issue price of shares and decreases as time goes by. The call feature of preference share provides flexibility to the issuer as in the case of call feature of bonds. The refund of preference shares depends upon the fluctuations the market is subjected to due to changes in interest rates and due to the value of the preference share call feature, which is determined more or less by the same considerations. So that is about preference shares stated call price. Now, in other words, now we'll see how Companies Act Section 80 makes sure there is no harm to creditors of company for distributing preference share capital by fresh issue of shares or from distributable profits by recording in capital redemption reserve account. We'll see how the mechanism works. In other words, so long as preference capital is appearing on the balance sheet, capital contributions by owners of the firm are represented, providing a security buffer to the company's creditors. See, a company's creditor may grant credit to the company based on some security. So preference capital sometimes is used as the security. However, when the preference shares are redeemed, the funds of the company are used to redeem the preference share capital, making the security available to creditors go low by such a redemption process. When it is redeemed after 20 years, preference shares have to be redeemed. The funds of the companies are used to redeem the preference share capital. So preference share capital simply does not exist because they get the funds and the preference share capital shareholders simply go, which would mean the security available to creditors may go low by such a redemption process. This is a cause of worry for the creditors who might have extended credit to the company based on the owner's contribution. So, to protect creditor interest and to preserve the security available to them, Companies Act Section 80 stipulates that the redemption of preference share capital can be redeemed out of profits that would otherwise be available for dividends and can be made out of a fresh issue of shares made for the purpose of redemption. So remember, in such a situation, fresh capital, that is preference shares, can be redeemed based on fresh issue of shares made for the purpose of redemption, or can be redeemed out of profits of the company. Also, when shares are redeemed out of distributable profits, that is profits that ought to be distributed as dividends, the face value of such shares which are redeemed must be transferred to the capital redemption reserve account out of profits that are distributable otherwise as dividends or distributable profits. So they actually are put in capital redemption reserve account. So that actually basically means there is no harm done to creditors of company for distributing preference share capital by fresh issue of shares or from distributable profits. So this completes a session on preference share capital. Thank you.